Hello and welcome to PSM Speak. Which bank is the safest for your money, to deposit your hard-earned money? There are many banks in the country, innumerable. 137 scheduled commercial banks. They have 1,54,087 offices across the country. This figure is as of December 2022 of Reserve Bank of India. In the 6 months, possible that more number of branches were added. These scheduled commercial banks alone have 178.55 lakh crore. That is 178 trillion. A little more than 178 trillion deposits they have with them, and then the advances of these scheduled commercial banks alone in the country amount to 135.45 lakh crore, 135 trillion. In addition to these scheduled commercial banks, which include the public sector banks, the private sector banks, the foreign banks, the regional rural banks, there are many other banks. Banks, both scheduled and non-scheduled. Scheduled are those which are included in the second schedule of the Reserve Bank of India. Then the other banks, both scheduled and other non-scheduled, non-commercial banks, the cooperative sector. We have rural cooperative banks, we have urban cooperative banks, and there are other banks like small finance banks and so on. Which is the safest bank? Then recently, the Reserve Bank of India, not very recently, it was on January 2, 2023, it declared 3 banks in the country as domestic systemically important banks. D-SIBs, State Bank of India, ICICIbank, HDFC Bank. Globally also we have systemically important banks, G-SIBs. In 2022, the Financial Stability Board, of course in consultation with the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision and the national authorities, declared in 2022 30 banks as G-SIBs. These banks are very important banks, what internationally recognized insofar as G-SIBs are concerned, and in India the D-SIBs, domestic systemically important banks, State Bank of India, ICICI Bank and HDFC Bank. Are they really the safest banks for depositing our money? To know this, let us try to understand what D-SIBs are, what are G-SIBs are, and the history about them. As we know, there was financial crisis, global financial crisis. Of course, public memory is short, but the wounds are so deep and the scars remain. So we remember in 2007 and 2008, financial crisis in the banking industry. Following that, the Financial Stability Board, because the governments were required to bail out these banks with the public money, there needs to be some protective arrangement and identification of some banks as most important banks. To do that, the suggestion of Financial Stability Board to the Basel Committee, Basel is in Switzerland, Basel Committee on Banking Supervision. This organization, BCBS, is located in Basel. So it recommended to the BCBS to come out with a framework for global systemically important banks. In response, in 2010, the BCBS came out with the framework, the criterion to have adequate capital and other requirements. Then the FSB, in consultation with the BCBS, in terms of the framework and consulting the national authorities, disclosed a list of global systemically important banks. That was in the year 2012. 28 banks were identified as G-SIBs. And then the year 2013, the number increased to 29. And recently for 2022, 30 banks are identified as global systemically important banks. Which is the most important and least important among them? They were put in the buckets, the categorization of them. The 30 G-SIBs were put in different buckets, 5 buckets. Bucket 1 to bucket 5. Bucket 5 is the most important bucket, and the 1 is the least important among the banks chosen. You can see from this list the names of the global systemically important banks. Bucket 5 is empty. Bucket 4, only 1 bank, which means among the banks listed, that 1 bank is the most important. And then in bucket 3, you see 3 banks, and bucket 2, 7 banks. In bucket 1, we see 19 banks. Similarly, the domestic systemically important banks are also placed in different buckets. In domestic systemically important banks, bucket 5 and 4 are empty, and State Bank of India figures in bucket 3. ICICI Bank, HDFC Bank are in bucket 1. So in the given 3 banks, State Bank of India is the most important. A little more about D-SIBs. The member countries of Financial Stability Board were advised to work out a framework for the domestic systemically important banks. And then the Reserve Bank of India, in 2014, it worked out a framework, criteria for listing the banks as systemically important banks. Various considerations were there. The important among them is the size of the bank. Then the non-substitutability. The bank is so important that if it fails, it is difficult to find a substitute for that. These banks involved in cross-jurisdictional activities. They have crucial interconnectedness. Their failure will not be limited to their own failure, but will affect the other banks, the banking activities in the country. Not only the banking activities in the country, whole economy would suffer if these banks fail. So several safeguards are worked out to avoid their failure in the interest of the national economy as a whole, not only the interest of the depositors of the bank. The State Bank of India, for example, which is in bucket 3, is required to get additional capital of 0.60% of the risk-weighted assets of the bank. And the other 2 banks, ICICI Bank and the HDFC Bank, they are required to get additional 0.20 capital. So whatever these details, these banks are too big to fail. They are called TBTF banks, and government is interested to protect them. So we can think that these banks are safe banks because Reserve Bank of India has identified they are the safest banks Not that the other banks are not safe. When Reserve Bank of India gives license, Reserve Bank of India has its own controls, regulations. Depending upon the institution, there are the controls of the other governmental agencies on them. So I am not suggesting that the other banks are not safest. These three banks are the safest. And as for our deposits in the banks, I am talking of the other banks, including these banks. Up to 5 lakh rupees per bank is safe is another thing that we should know. This is because of the guarantee by the Deposit Insurance and Credit Guarantee Corporation. I will make another video to explain on that 5 lakhs limit and DICGC. Thank you very much for watching this video. Please subscribe to this channel if you have not done it already. Subscription, as you know, is free, but it will encourage me to get to you more videos of this type. Thank you.